Welcome to the Iyun Podcast, an in-depth look at Charedi society, Israel, and the Jewish people. I am your host, Ari Koretsky, and I invite you to join us as we confront the challenges, joys, and possibilities of Torah-centered living in an evolving world. The Iyun Podcast, Think Again. One of the great challenges that exists in the relationship between the Israeli Charedi and American Charedi communities is simply a lack of cultural fluency, a misunderstanding one of the other in terms of the realities on the ground. In particular, those in the Charedi or Charedi adjacent communities in America not having a clear sense of the actual risks, challenges, and possibilities of army service in Israel for those in the Charedi sector. There seems to be a lot of misgivings, misunderstandings, misimpressions surrounding this topic. A number of rabbis, in particular Rabbis Mordechai Becher, Rabbi Yitzchak Eisenmann, and today's guest, Rabbi Yitzchak Adlerstein, have undertaken to bridge this gap by embarking on what we might call a Hasbara tour of various American communities to explore and explicate the case for increased Charedi participation in not only the armed services, but society at large. For our American listeners, which is likely most, if not all of them, certainly English speaking, this should be of particular interest, given that so much of the funding and moral scaffolding, if you will, does emerge from these corners. And so the American and broader Anglo community does play, in fact, a very important role in shaping the future of the broader community of B'nai Torah, charedim, in Israel and beyond. And so with this framework and a sense of the gravity involved in these conversations, we share our conversation with Rabbi Yitzchak Adlerstein. We are here with Rabbi Yitzchak Adlerstein, the Director of Interfaith Affairs for the Simon Wiesenthal Center, a longtime writer, editor at the Cross Currents blog, wears many other hats as well. For the purposes of our conversation today, he's also someone who's made Aliyah in recent years and currently lives in Yerushalayim in the remote neighborhood. And most relevant for our conversation today and for this Iyun podcast in general is that he has been on a bit of a barnstorming or Hasbara tour discussing the subject of Charedi army conscription with thought leaders and stakeholders in the United States in various cities. So first of all, how are you, Rabbi Adlerstein?
Great, because I'm heading back pretty soon to Israel, which I miss intensely. Place is addictive.
There we go. I guess since we're all heading back soon, we should all be doing great. So tell us a little bit about what you've been up to in this particular context in terms of this whole concept of IDF service. Obviously, this is among the most contentious and vexing questions in modern Israeli and really modern Jewish society. In particular, a challenge lately, what's kind of new is that it's really become difficult from the Dati Leumi or the religious Zionist perspective. That whole community has become very, very upset, let's say, incensed, if you will, at the lack of service. And there's a lot swirling around this topic. We've covered it pretty extensively on this show in many, many different episodes. But you have taken it upon yourself with some colleagues to try to do some work in the United States around this topic. So tell us a little bit about what you've been trying to do and sort of what the genesis of that idea was.
Well, let's start with the second first. The genesis of it is a marketer in London who decided that he has kids in Sahel. He identifies somewhat with the Charedi world, pretty much with the Charedi world, and having a really hard time navigating being both Charedi aligned and having kids in Sahel. So he put together three of us. Two of us are Rav Mordechai Becher and Rav Yitzchak Eisenmann, both household names in the Charedi world. Ran Yitzchak even gets to write a column in Mishpacha, which they wouldn't let me do. I mean, somehow he has street cred in at least the modernish Charedi world that reads Mishpacha.
Might be his coat,
The three of us together are now part of an organization, an effort called InStep Together. So, truth be told, the two of them, because they have kids in Tzahal, are much more focused and oriented on the role of Tzahal itself for charedim, correcting some of the stereotypes, and there are stereotypes about what the army does to charedim and what the intention of the army is. And I'm in it for sort of like the bigger picture. And I guess the bigger picture, which is the way charedim in Israel have navigated the last 15 months and how difficult it is for Anglo-Charedi who have I would say, a substantially different chinuch world outlook than Chareidim in Israel do, how to navigate listening to the pronouncements of the community with a pit in one's stomach. It just doesn't jive. It doesn't resonate. There are parts of it which are profoundly disturbing to some people, not to all. It really boils down to some Chareidim, Anglo-Charedim who come to Israel, go there warned that if you're going to survive here, you've really got to pick a side. You've got to pick a camp. Hagam, even though it's true that things are often more binary in the United States than they are in Israel, where even after you pick the sides, there's more conversation between people and families and things like that. But nonetheless, ideologically, you're warned before you hand in the papers to Nefesh B'Nefesh, you've got to make a choice. And when you make that choice, don't be a fool. If you think you're going to change the system, forget about it. If you think you're going to survive as a lone individual, maintaining your old hashkafos, not going to work. And even if it did work, it won't work for your kids. So many people come and they bite the bullet, and it works for them, and that's fine. But there are others for whom it's not working. As a matter of fact, I would contend that telling people that they have to make it work has thrown cold water on Aliyah for potential olim in the yeshiva-trained and seminary-trained camps of the United States, because they don't want to kind of believe and act and submit themselves to the same kind of restrictions and conventions. So it's been hard for many people, not everybody, but for a good number of people. So you have individuals like Rabbi Pfeffer, like yourself, who are sort of preaching a different attitude towards what the role of charedim should be in terms of the larger society. So this is where I kind of start. I tell people that, hey, I identify Charedi. Wikipedia says I'm Charedi. Who am I to disagree? You went through Charedi chinuch. Not all of them initially admit to being Charedi, and they ask the question, well, what does it mean to be Charedi? And then I give them two definitions: the Israeli definition of Charedi, which is, say, in that case, I'm definitely not Charedi. And then I give them sort of my own Anglo definition of Charedi, in which case I say, I guess I am Charedi. But I ask them, like, how comfortable they are with what they're reading, with what they're expected to believe and to pass on to their kids. And many of them are not at all. As a matter of fact, one of the interesting things that I've learned on this trip is a new addition to my lexicon. There are a few people in one city where I had a meeting called themselves reluctant charedim, which it channels something that I heard many, many years ago from my good friend Dennis Prager. We should have a refuah shlema, who said frequently I don't care what branch of Judaism you identify with, as long as you're ashamed of it. There's much wisdom to that. So I feel that there's been a lot that I've been ashamed of in the last 15 months. And I said, and specifically, I'm here to tell you parts of the story that you've missed. Well, why do you think I've missed on anything? I'll tell you why. Because I'll tell you what you read to get the news. You read Mishpacha, not Mishpacha. You read Mishpacha, you read briefings from the Aguda, and you read Yeshiva World News. And from those, you get a picture of what's going on in Eretz Yisrael. Now, some are digging deeper than that and get other parts of the picture as well. But I found many people really don't. That is an accurate way of describing their information feeders. And I said, are you aware of what's happened in the last 3 months? What's happened in the last 3 months? So I said, look, you know that there's been a rift between the Dati Leumi community and the Charedi community. You also are aware that estimates are that among casualties of the war, 60% have been sustained by Dati Leumi, specifically what we would call Dati Leumi Torani. It means the more learning, yeshiva-oriented parts of the Dati Leumi world. So you know that there's a rift, and you know that there's tension. But you probably believe, as was true for decades, yes, there was a schism, there was tension, there was animosity, but there was also begrudging, lingering respect of sorts. It's not our hashkafa, but we understand that there are parts of it that we very much identify with: the limud Torah, the adherence to halacha, the yira shamayim. And you think that that's sort of the way things stand right now. Well, let me tell you that in the last 3 months, that has changed dramatically. What started off as a rift and with animosity has turned into, and I hate to use the word, but it's true, into utter hatred. That people in the Dati Leumi world have come to hate their relatives, to tell their kids, we don't speak to them anymore. We want nothing to do with them. And that comes from two things. Not only the issue of giyus, of draft into Tzahal, but of the message that has been promoted by Charedi, the Charedi system, as opposed to Charedi individuals. Now, they always say, but look, what about Shai Groucher? And what about, my sister-in-law is spending hours a day preparing food for families where the breadwinner is in Miluim, and they certainly have Hakaras Hatov. They have gratitude for the soldiers. And yeah, absolutely. There are thousands of them, but they're doing it as individuals. The official stance of the community has been separatism. I cite Rivka Ravitz, right, who ran the president's office, I think, for his 2 successive presidents, I believe. Fascinating woman, but in a recent interview, when she was asked what the definition of Charedi is, she said, Chareidism means separatism, means isolation.
Which is ironic considering the role she held.
Right.
Bit of cognitive dissonance there. But I mean, do you feel that people are, when you talk about reluctant charedim, do you feel that people are bothered by sort of the tone, the pronouncements that's coming out of the community? Or do you feel that people really, if they knew what was going on, would actually want to see changed behavior? Because you started by talking more about the tone that, these sort of radical, if we can call them that, messaging, things that, recordings that come out and so forth. And then at the same time, you're talking about the actual changed behavior that the Dati Leumi world at least would like to see from the Charedi community. So what do you think that Americans are most sort of ashamed of by their community, if you will, by their denomination?
Well, I'm not sure that enough of them are ashamed. I think that was part of the mission, to sort of tell people what's really been going on. And I'd have a hard time differentiating between the two halves of what you say. I think they're inextricably bound up with one another, that the reason for the messaging is the same reason as preventing any real change in the gisha and the approach to tzahal. There's so many people within the Charedi world who say, yeah, like we see it coming, that somehow what we really want to see is an accommodation for those people who really are learning. Of the 66 to 70,000 exemptions that exist for what's called Torah to umnato, Toraso umnaso, that they're learning according to the Chazon Ish 3 Siddharim a day. The politicians got it one Seder shaved off a couple of decades later. So now Toraso umnaso, in contravention to Shulchan Aruch, is only 2 Siddharim a day. But okay, I can live with that. A lot of other people can live with that as well. And the estimates there are that no more than 7,000 to 20,000 really fit that. That means 50,000 are either learning very part-time or not at all. And the idea that they should be able to stand at the side while the country is bleeding and say, but we're just uncomfortable being exposed to any challenges from outside our community, is very tough to stomach unless you were brought up that way. If you are brought up that way, you don't even question it. It's not even a question. But those of us who were not brought up that way, it sounds like a pretty darn serious ethical question. Can you say, well, I don't think I'll become a shagus, but I might not come out quite as, I don't know what, quite as Haredi as when I walked in, and I don't want to face that challenge. So you can do that if you're living in Monroe, but can you do that while living in the middle of the largest Jewish community in the world? I think when American Chareidim hear about the messaging, my experience has been, but people don't know that the official message of the community was that from day one, no, Bachrim in their spare time should not go to Levias. No, Bachrim in their spare time should not be visiting soldiers in hospitals. This was actively discouraged. And it wasn't discouraged under wraps, because you can't keep anything under wraps. That means that this was what was being fed the rest of the country while they're watching their sons, their husbands, their relatives bleeding, their breadwinners go off to 3 successive terms of service in Miluim. There are others who are saying, we don't go, we don't participate, we do have a Hakar Satov. And I think the overwhelming majority of the Charedi world has that Hakar Satov. Despite some of the extremist statements you could find, I think the overwhelming majority have real Hakar Satov. But I cite to them Rav Wolbe, who's a very citable name in the Charedi world, where Rav Wolbe writes that being nosei ba'ol chavero doesn't mean feeling intensely the pain of another when there is something you could actually do for them.
Actually shouldering the burden.
Right. And whether the burden is service, which has become right now the most intense focus of attention, or it means sharing the burden by going out there and saying, hey, you're our brothers and sisters. We feel pain for you. We're going to do whatever we can. There are women who are doing it, thousands who are preparing the meals and helping out, but it's not the official stance of the community. The official stance is we live a life apart. And indeed, you don't see in Charedi communities anything resembling the kind of connection to the war that you do in the rest of the country. Chareidim, to a large extent, are living in their own self-created bubble, and there are good reasons for the creation of that bubble. And I talk about that also. I'm not coming to tell them that we've got to remake the system. The system works for some people, for lots of people, and has been responsible for lots of terrific things and fantastic growth in Torah and Limud Torah. But There are things that just seem wrong. And if you think that they're wrong, don't think you're alone. There are major Talmidei Chachamim who feel the same way. Most of them will not be cited by name. That's a fact of life in the Charedi world. Remember Sharansky in his best work on democracy gave his definition of democracy as any place where you can stand in the town square and speak your opinion against the government and not be imprisoned. Use that and decide whether the Charedi community is a democracy. No way. If you sound off on what you really feel in our community, your daughter will not get a shidduch. Your kids will be barred from certain schools. You will be ostracized, perhaps, by many of your friends. Okay, that's not what we're here talking about, but that's a fact of life in the Haredi world. So there are lots of people, I don't blame them in the slightest. The Dati Leumi world does blame them for knowing that they really believe that change has to come all over in the gisha of the Haredi community relative vis-a-vis the rest of the country, but they won't say it publicly. So for many people, including myself, it's enough to know that they're there, enough to be able to speak to them privately. But for others, Rav Weiss, for example, has taken a big hit in the last couple of months. He had huge buy-in in the Dati Leumi world. So many people look up to him. It's what the soldiers, when they finish the Daf Yomi, they're learning Minchas Asher, special edition published for them to take to the front. But many of them have said, look, we know what you really feel. At least we think we do. But so get up and say it. And they don't realize he can't. As soon as he does, he's no longer Rav Weiss. That'll work for me. It won't work for them.
Okay, so how are you actually going about organizing this kind of tour, and you and the other colleagues? Tell me, kind of take me through the mechanics of this process. Are you you're touring around? You galvanize certain kind of like a nucleus of people in each different American cities, and you're having these like roundtable discussions. What are you actually doing, nuts and bolts?
I would say that this was really a test drive of the vehicle. I'm here with my wife at the last day of a 4-week grandchildren nachas tour. And they took us to different cities. In each city, I'd either have my kids or acquaintances say, hey, listen, can you help me out? This is what I'm interested in talking about. I need a venue for catharsis. Help me out. In most cases, it worked. In some cases, I had to cry. But eventually, there's one city that it didn't look very good, but I knew I was going to speak at Shalosh Shuddis in a large shul. So I did, and I said, by the way, what I'd really like to speak about is more details about this, but I haven't found a host yet. So of course, after Ma'ariv, the host appeared, and we had an event the next night. So that's what I've been doing. I've just been looking for people. It's usually worked. One place I went, had a long conversation with a couple, and they were totally on the same page. And then after some thought, called back and said, can't do it. Can't do it. If we do it, we are going to be ostracized by all of our friends here. So I guess we're looking for a particular niche, but I believe that there are many people in that niche. It certainly applies to many people in the Baal Tshuva community, whether the first generation or second generation, and many yeshiva and seminary trained people who say, this just doesn't seem right for us. And I try to explain when I get around to it, that what you're witnessing is the reaction of a community that we don't live in. It may be exactly what has to be done. That's what the manhigim of that community find is necessary as the stance in a country which is very politicized, where you don't just take stances ideologically, it has to be translated into politics. It perhaps is the right thing for them, but you shouldn't think that it's the right thing for us.
So who are you getting in the room? What's kind of the profile of people? I guess you're saying it's people that have this, sort of affinity for call it this liminal space between the Charedi world or moderate Charedi, reluctant Charedi, and you're getting around, around the dining room table or around the living room and just sort of introducing this topic. What's people's knowledge levels coming in? Kind of what's the process that's unfolding in these rooms?
Well, that's good description. And what happens is, what I found is that for the most part, American charedim are not aware of just what was what the dynamics were of the response of the Haredi community in Eretz Yisrael since the beginning of the war, and actually are pretty surprised by it because it's not what the mainstream, the Haredi MSM talks about. Nobody there is going to talk about what's happening in the Dati Lumi world. They will, the leftist parts of it will have great stories about individual soldiers and even officers, but not about hey, what's happening in the other community, which has been really a seismic shift. I think, with Tamir Granot's letter that went viral, sort of the key line in the end, where he said that all these years we expected, we more than tolerated, we respected, we lived side by side, we had kindness, but we still identified with the same basic principles because we really believed that when push came to shove, when the chips were down, that you'd have our back. And now we found out that that's not true. Oh. Now, whether you agree with that or not, or you have excuses or explanations, if that line doesn't hurt, then I think you're part of Charedi Yiddishkeit that I don't relate to. If that line doesn't hurt, if the letters from the almanas of the Kedoshim who gave up their lives, the ones that Rav Asher Weiss, day in and day out at every shir, calls tzaddikim, which is, itself a departure from the usual sprach in the Haredi world. If those don't move you to say, I don't know how to respond, but I feel diminished by it, by my not having a response. So again, to summarize, to answer your question, I found, first of all, there is a lack of knowledge. People are not filled in with all of the story because they're not reading Makor Rishon, and they're not going to get it in mainstream. They got to get it from you. So that's why we're here.
What are some of the responses in these rooms? Is it surprise? Is it indifference? Is it are you experiencing conversion stories? The baptisms by
I would say minor conversions is one reaction. Everybody wants to know, okay, so what's the bottom line? What do you want from us? And I have like three bottom lines, one which is, spacey, hashkafic, one which is downright, what's the new word? Tachleidic, and one in between. So when I get around to the tachleidic and the one that's not spacey, they nod their heads and say, yeah, I guess we never thought about that. That's something we should keep in mind. That's one reaction. So that's a kind of conversion. I didn't tell you what the tachleidic expectation is yet. Yeah. We'll get there. But I also get the reaction that, like, I hear what you're saying, but aren't you really telling us that we should not be accepting what is told to us is Das Torah? So that's a response. It's a frequent response. Sometimes I have to get into a little discussion about it. I remember one place that I spoke. I said, okay, so your chinuch, as was mine, but you're a generation younger in some cases. There were people who were 2 generations younger. So our chinuch has been that whether you understand it or not, what comes out of whatever person is on top of the pyramid, that is our hashkafa, and that's what we support, whether we understand it or not. So I basically tell them 2 things. First of all, realize that that's not the only definition of Das Torah, and if it were, then it immediately excluded the entire Sephardic world and the entire Hasidic world, who certainly don't look up to those same people.
Well,
Except
the response would be that at least they have their own luminaries to whom they are loyal.
right, and our response has to be that so do we. There is not necessarily one person or two people who speak for the entire yeshiva world, such that everybody, and that's dangerous. Some people find that dangerous. I got a lot of lip today from my own sister, who said, "But where does this end?" But I've enjoyed being in an audience where I said, "I'll prove to you that you don't accept our Torah," and I pull out my cell phone and I put it down on the table and said, "How many of you have one of these objects, these devices?" And they all say yes. I said, "You're not listening to Dastar. So you're picking and choosing." Okay, I mean that seriously, not as a joke. It means that somehow your chinuch is that you recognize that sometimes things are needs of a particular community and not necessarily the prevailing hashkafa or way of doing business in a different part of the community where circumstances can be very different. So I'm suggesting to you that the same thing is true, not about Tzahal so much, because here in the United States, that's not the issue of whether we're going to Tzahal. It has to do primarily with, this was one of my main takeaways, a sense of what Am Yisrael is. So this is one also that I meet with a kind of surprise and buy-in, that the same way that many of us, not most of us, recognize that in our chinuch, in the chinuch of our children and grandchildren, there was a big lapse when it came to Eretz Yisrael. The centrality of Eretz Yisrael, how important that is, was not something that was ever stressed. Even how we came back to Eretz Yisrael, the history is very heavily rewritten and does not give a sense of what went into, and the nisim that went into, and hashgacha that went into. But more important is the value of it. And a number of years ago, writing in an OU publication, the OU felt that they had to put something out on the 70th anniversary of Hakamas Medina. Dr. Aviva Weisbord, Shalom, wrote a piece. I wrote a piece, an essay in the same thing. I have no idea what I wrote, but I tell people, forget about what I wrote, just read hers. And she said that one of her disappointments is that in the chinuch of her children, there really was no chinuch about the value of Eretz Yisrael, because there's such a fear that since it's the tziodim who push it, so we have to run in the other direction. So my contention is, okay, could I get a drum roll here? My contention is that there is another major part of our chinuch which is lacking, and that is the importance of Am Yisrael qua Am Yisrael. That means not just a collection of a few million, many million, Baruch Hashem, of individual Tyre and Neshamas that are all Yidden and that we have chiyuvim to as individuals, but there's such a thing as an Am Yisrael that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made a bris with. And that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu decides on Rosh Hashanah what's going to happen in the next year, he's looking at us as individuals, Kibnei Maron, but he's also looking at the state of Klal Yisrael, of Am Yisrael. How is the nation doing? That means the nation with all the warts and all the faults. And that has also been undervalued and underplayed. And I think had it not been, it would have been impossible for the Charedi community to stand aside. And I think this is where it would be dangerous for us to say, well, look, our chinuch is that we don't ask questions, we just go by what's going out there. That means that you are missing for yourself and for your kids an appreciation of something that the Ribono Shalom himself loves and cherishes. That's Am Yisrael as a nation.
My question is that I'm hearing certainly two different things. On the one hand, I'm hearing this message that people should be feeling more in America, but really ultimately doing more in Israel, right? That more should happen in the Charedi community. But I'm also hearing kind of a Charedi pluralism from you that, well, this is okay for, this is okay for them. That messaging maybe works for them and their community, but for the Anglo community outside of Israel, it doesn't work.
And inside, outside and inside.
Fine, but fair enough. But at the end of the day, is your bottom line messaging that you believe there needs to be substantive change within the internal Haredi community, Israeli Haredi community,
Of
or are
course.
you okay? But then I heard you say also though that they have their hanhaga, their leadership, their political way of operating, and maybe that works for them, right? But so which is it?
I think the important one, it is a reality that things can change and most likely will. It could be if Bibi loses his nerve or decides that maintaining the coalition is more important than anything else, he will come up with a draft law which will then kick the can down the road, but not solve the problem. There are many people in the Charedi world, again, they're all anonymous, for saying that leadership, for its own reasons, will, and I don't think they're terrible reasons, I think they're defensible reasons, will not be agreeable to make the changes on their own, but they'll live with them if they're made for them. And that the only way is going to be some pressure. And that there's so many people in the Charedi world who say our bottom line really should be that anybody who is a serious learner gets to learn uninterrupted, does not have to spend those crucial years of, let's say, 18 to 23, 24, with anything else on their mind but learning if they can. But when they leave, they should do something like Shlav Bet and fill a void that we've only discovered in the last 15 months, that we have major communities that are essentially defenseless because we don't have the manpower to station Sahel there all the time. And that we need people actively patrolling and defending our communities from within. So the real learners should learn uninterrupted, with full exemption, but when they leave, some kind of Shlav Bet training, and then the other 50,000, we have to find a way that somehow the Supreme Court and the Attorney General will not be able to tamper with. I know it's a big job, but it's not impossible, to create an experience within Sahel that allows for full participation of soldiers with Haredi sensitivities and needs. We have high hopes for this Chativat Hashmonaim.
Yeah, just today as we're recording, I saw that the first 50 members were inducted.
Right. So 50 sounds, what a joke. It's not a joke. 50 is not a joke. And every one of them, if they have a successful experience, is going to come back, and his first cousin is going to start questioning, like maybe I should consider that as well. So it's not a joke. It's not a bad beginning. But I get more tachleidic than that. So if you buy the general picture, that it's not just Sahel, it's a question of identifying with Am Yisrael and feeling part of a reborn Jewish nation. Rav Kook used to say that people shouldn't be so harsh on his opponents, their complete rejection of him and what he stood for. He said, for the last 2,000 years, we've survived, Ashtei Hashem. We survived as small communities, as families, as individuals, but we did not survive as a nation. To reacquaint the Jewish people with the idea of nationhood is going to take some time. I think by now we've had enough time. And this war certainly contributed to a feeling of major parts of the country that didn't feel it before October 7th. So it's time that, we got with the program also. So what do I urge them? And I urge anybody listening to this podcast as well, is to acquaint yourself with those organizations, with those efforts that are trying to do more to allow for Haredi participation in general society. Whether it means Sahel, whether it means the workplace, whether it means academia, for those who want it. and to help them make move the transition. I don't want to call it a transition because it shouldn't be a transition. To be able to safely navigate the road to participating in those things. We're talking about academic programs that every major Israeli institution has. The feminists are trying to undo it, and in some cases have undone it. But there's still others that are functioning in which men, women who want to participate and want to get degrees and want to get real training, get it. I'm talking about things like Charedi Hesder Yeshivot, of which there are at least 3 that I'm aware of. At least 3. Of Nachal Charedi, and with all the jokes you'll make about, well, Chareidim don't go to Nachal Charedi. It's true, mostly. But they have ex-Chareidim or sons of ex-Chareidim who still know what it's like, and they do wonders with them. The day before I departed for the States, I visited 2 Nachal Charedi bases. Yeah, it's true. It didn't have the feeling of a Charedi place, but the guys, such sweet guys, with purpose. These guys may not even have made it alive if they didn't have tzal. People forget how tzal can make mention out of people, how it can be one of the most important rehabilitation efforts in the land of Israel. I've become a booster of Nachal Charedi, despite the jokes. I think they're doing a terrific job. When you see soldiers there who otherwise would be shooting it up and are totally clean of that for a couple of years, and now their complaint is that they've been promised some action 50 feet away. They're mamish on the border. They've been telling them, no, we're not ready yet. You have to wait another week. And they're rearing to go. They're rearing to go to contribute to Am Yisrael. So I'm just asking people to keep an eye out on the organizations, on the efforts that are out there. And, when you're writing your checks, that should be part of it. And at the same time, do it with a kind of confidence, knowing that there can be more than one Charedi hashkafa.
Well, you mentioned writing checks. I think one of the complicating factors is that you have this sort of meeting of East and West, if you will, whereby those from a more, call it extremist position, more insular position, are often bankrolled by those who are the more moderate community members, perhaps because that latter group feels somehow that this is representative of the authentic, Judaism that they themselves can't live up to, but at least can support financially, can sort of buy a portion into that. These financial dynamics, I think, complicate things quite a bit. Have you discussed that in these conversations?
Yes. And the last thing that anybody's going to hear from me is that they should use the power of the purse and withhold funding. They shouldn't. They should do 2 things. They should also fund some of the ones that are closer to their own sensibilities. Plus, when they're writing the checks, they should convey their feelings at the same time. Because in the end, the messaging that people coming from Eretz Yisrael get when they speak to American contributors, philanthropists, kavirim, whatever you want to call them, all of the above, is going to be important in their assessment of how long they can keep on resisting without even negotiating with the other side.
So you mentioned these three takeaways or 3 bottom lines that you're hoping for people. One being the consideration of organizations that are doing work in this space, broadly speaking. What are some of the others, and particularly your pie in the sky kind of vision for people?
So again, the second one, which I think is practical, which I will keep on pushing, is the idea of Am Yisrael. And the importance of Am Yisrael. That
it's really a sentiment more than a particular action item.
I wouldn't call it a sentiment. I'd call it a hashkafa. It's an important part of our hashkafa sachayim. I think the Makoros are all there, and I guess it's the job of myself and others to try to make this more obvious to people. But yes, okay, that's the middle one. The pie in the sky one is that I've alluded to it before, and I don't think I'm going to say much more about it now, is the idea that there are different definitions of Charedi out there. The Israeli one does not work for Americans, and it doesn't work particularly well even for Anglos living in Eretz Yisrael. It had to for decades because you had to fit in to one of two worlds. But at a kenes recently in Yerushalayim, a speaker who was speaking to Anglo-Charedim said that, it's nice to have representatives here in this hall of the four major groupings within Charedi Judaism, Charedi Yiddishkeit. What are the four? So everybody can name three. There's the Hasidish, the Sephardic, the Litvish, and he said, and the fourth is the Anglo. So there's the recognition for the first time that there's a sort of a separate sub-community within the Haredi world that maybe is a little different. They play basketball, other things that aren't approved of. And for many of those living there, we estimate that there are about 300,000 Anglos living in Eretz Yisrael, of which about 100,000 are likely Chareidim, Anglo-Charedim, what we call Charedim. What do we call Charedim? What's this other definition of Charedim? It's not isolation is the key word. The key words are putting limud Torah on the highest pedestal and undiluted, uncompromised adherence to halakha. We went to schools that preached it. We sent our own kids to schools that preached it, even when those schools were not as good in other areas. But those were the values that we valued the most, insisted upon, live, talk about, breathe, sometimes in the breach, but they are part of our active vocabulary. And that's enough to make us Charedi. And that usually works. The definition, well, I've found that when people listen to it, says, yeah, that's me, I guess, whether it's reluctant or not, but that's me. In that group, people have to realize that it's not a cause of embarrassment to say that I'm part of that group. I'll say as a mashal, what Rav Aaron Lapiansky, my good friend, did for working people in the United States, suggesting Ben Torah for life. You can have a job and not consider yourself a b'diavad. You're not a b'diavad. You're doing the Ratzon Hashem. And this is how you do it, keeping to the highest values that you had while you were sitting in the base medrash. So I would say to lots of Anglo-Charedim that maintaining the stance that you have about Tzahal, Hakars Tov to them, doing for them, wanting to feel part of a nation, even when you have your own separate values, those things are important. They're not a b'diavad, they're different. And you should not feel like you're a second-class citizen, which is what the mainstream Haredi community will make you feel like. You have to have the confidence as a person with your chaverim, with the rav of your shul, with the little sub-community that you have, to recognize that there are different ways to slice the Das Torah cake.
Just in closing, tell us a little bit more about this InStep Together effort and what's the plans moving forward in terms of going to more cities. You said you're just kind of on a test run right now. What's the grand vision here for, again, this kind of broader Hasbara effort?
Yeah, I don't know how grand it is, but I think that to have an evening with three people together, all of them have some Haredi cred, even if they try to take it away from us, would be very stimulating to subgroups of the community. So what InStep Together is hoping for is that there'll be more interest in this. We have some funding. In other words, communities will be able to have us come and visit, not pay anything, maybe more than local expenses, no solicitation of funds, but to talk honestly and openly with groups and then with individuals about what's going on. My other two colleagues will speak more about the actual Sahel experience, about when it can pose problems for people's Yiddishkeit and when it can't. What advances have been made, and huge advances have been made in the religiosity or the attitude towards that across the army and the non-religious units, and who are the major malfeasors, who are the bad players. There's still many of them around. We think that there are fewer of them every year, that the old-time IDF elitists at the top, who are anti-Torah, anti-Dat, they hate Dati Leumi as much as they hate Chareidim, that they are disappearing, and I think that October 7th is going to make more of them go away than preserve them. So there's hope for the future, and things are changing. But we think that audiences will want to hear about this, will want to react against us, will want to hear us, and we're hoping we'll get the invitations.
Where can people learn more about this, or if they want to host such an event or participate in one, how can they reach out and get involved in that manner?
So there's a website, InStepTogether.org. There's a little bit more information. I don't know how much, but certainly there you can get some guidance on how to take it to the next step in case you're interested, or in case you want to find out where I live and break my windows.
Okay, Rabbi Yitzchak Adlerstein, hopefully we'll continue to hear from you for many years to come. Windows intact, and if anything, you're creating those windows through which people can see one another, different parts of the community, which hopefully will continue to bear fruit and benefit, as you say, all of Am Yisrael, this wonderful, organic, sometimes chaotic, but beautiful, beautiful edifice that we have as a people together. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.